Have you ever been pushed so far that the person you used to be simply burns away, leaving behind something harder, something colder, something you don't even recognize in the mirror? Where are you watching this from right now? A quiet home? A safe place? I pray you are. I want you to hold on to that feeling of safety, because for a long time, in my town, that feeling was a luxury none of us could afford. My name is Martha Collins, and this is the story of how I, a 68-year-old retired school teacher, burned down an empire to get justice for my son. If you believe in fighting for what's right, even when the whole world tells you to sit down and shut up, then do me a small favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It costs you nothing, but it tells my team and me that these stories matter, that you're out there, listening. Now, let's begin. The phone call came at 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday. I know the exact time because I was watching the old grandfather clock in the hall, the one my husband, Frank, bought at a flea market 40 years ago. Its tick-tock was the steady heartbeat of my quiet house, a rhythm I'd come to rely on since he'd been gone. The shrill ring of the telephone was a violation, a screech of metal on metal that ripped through the calm. Calls after 9 p.m. in a town like ours, Blackwater Creek, meant one of two things: death or the hospital. My hand trembled as I picked up the receiver. It was the hospital. The voice on the other end was a young woman, her tone professionally flat, trying and failing to hide the pity. "Mrs. Collins? It's about your son, Ethan." My blood went cold. It's a feeling I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, that sudden icy plunge in your gut when you know, before they even say the words, that your world has just tilted off its axis. There's been an incident at the mine. He's been admitted. He's stable. But the doctor needs to speak with you. The drive to St. Jude's was a blur of streetlights smearing across my tear-filled eyes. Blackwater Creek is a company town, and that company is Hale Mining. The mountain that looms over us isn't just a landmark, it's our provider and our undertaker. It gave my Frank a job for 35 years, and it took his lungs with black lung disease a decade later. It gave my Ethan a good engineering position, a way to stay close to home, and now it was trying to take him to an incident. That's what they called it. A bland, sterile word for what I knew in my bones was an act of violence. Ethan was a safety engineer. He didn't have incidents. He prevented them. For months. He'd been worried, coming over for Sunday dinner with a deep furrow in his brow, telling me about rusted support beams, faulty ventilation reports, and the pressure from the top to cut corners. They're putting profits over people. "Mom," he'd said just last week, his voice low and angry, "and Victor Hale doesn't care who gets buried as long as his pockets are lined." When I finally saw my son, the world tilted again. He was lying in a sterile white bed, a constellation of purple and black bruises blooming across his face. His left arm was in a thick cast, his ribs were taped, and one eye was swollen completely shut. A long, stitched gash ran from his temple to his jaw. This was no mining accident. This wasn't a rock fall or an equipment malfunction. This was the work of fists, of boots. This was a message. A young doctor, looking far too tired for his age, pulled me aside in the hallway. "His official report says he slipped and fell against some machinery," he said, refusing to meet my eyes. "But his injuries, Mrs. Collins, they aren't consistent with that." He lowered his voice to a whisper. "Two of Hale's foremen brought him in. They left before the police could arrive." The police? I almost laughed. Our town's sheriff, a man I'd taught in the 3rd grade, owed his job, his car, and probably his mortgage to Victor Hale's generosity. There would be no investigation, no report, just a closed case file citing an unfortunate accident. I sat by Ethan's bed all night, listening to the strained whistle of his breath. Sometime before dawn, he stirred. His one good eye fluttered open and found me. "Mom," he rasped, his voice hoarse. I told them. I had the documents. I was going to the press." A single tear escaped from his swollen eye and traced a path through the grime and blood on his cheek. "They took them. Hale was there. He watched." And in that moment, something inside me broke. It was the part of me that believed in rules, in civility, in the system. The part that believed if you just did the right thing, everything would work out. They say silence is golden, but in my town, silence was the price of survival, a price my son refused to pay. And that phone call, that sterile hospital room, that broken body of my only boy, that was the receipt for his courage. I held his hand, the smooth, uncalloused hand of an engineer, so different from his father's rough, scarred hands, and I made a silent vow. They wanted silence? I would give them a reckoning that would echo through these hills for a generation. The days that followed were a long, slow crawl through a fog of antiseptic smells, hushed doctors' consultations, and the rhythmic beeping of machines that tethered my son to the living. I'd sit in that stiff vinyl chair by his bedside for hours, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. During those quiet moments, the past had a way of creeping in, uninvited. My mind kept drifting back to another man who had suffered for that same mountain. My Frank. I pulled a worn photograph from my wallet, its edges soft from years of handling. It was from our 20th anniversary. Frank was standing proudly in our small backyard, a lopsided grin on his face, his arm around a teenage Ethan. Even in the faded color, you could see the faint bluish tint to the scar tissue on his knuckles, the indelible mark of coal dust that had worked its way under the skin over decades. Scars of the mountain. Frank called them his tattoos, a permanent record of his life's work. Ethan had scars now, too, not from honest labor, but from a brutal beating meant to silence him. They were two generations of the same family, marked by the same entity, Hale Mining. Victor Hale's father had run the mine when Frank started, and the stories were the same. Safety was an expense, not a priority. Men were numbers on a balance sheet. Frank used to come home, his face black with dust, and tell me about the near misses, the faulty equipment they were forced to use, the way the company fought tooth and nail against every union request for better ventilation or stronger supports. "We're just ghosts in the machine. Martha," he'd said once, his voice heavy with a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Ghosts digging our own graves." He died gasping for air, his lungs little more than hardened, black sponges. The company sent a check for $5,000 and a sympathy card signed by a secretary. Sitting there in that quiet hospital room, tracing the outline of Frank's face on the photograph, I realized he was right. We were all just ghosts, haunted by this town, this mountain, this one family. The Hale family had built their mansion on a hill overlooking the town, a constant reminder of who held the power. They funded the town library, so they got to put their name on it. They sponsored the high school football team, so the scoreboard flashed "Go Miners," courtesy of Hale Mining. They controlled everything, from the jobs to the town council. They had turned our home into a modern-day feudal state. And we, the people of Blackwater Creek, had let them. We'd been too scared, too tired, too dependent on the paychecks that came from their mine. We traded our silence for a semblance of security, never realizing we were just tenants in a town they owned. The reporter Ethan had planned to meet called the hospital, a young man named Ben Carter from the county paper. He sounded nervous, but determined. "Mrs. Collins, I heard what happened. Is Ethan—" I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. "They tried to kill him, Mr. Carter. That's what happened." There was a pause on the other end. "I believe you," he said, his voice firming up. "Ethan called me 3 days ago. He said he had proof of safety violations being deliberately covered up, invoices for substandard materials, falsified inspection reports. He said Hale was personally signing off on them." My knuckles went white as I gripped the phone. This was it. This was what they were so desperate to hide. "They took his briefcase," I whispered. "He said Hale was there." Another silence. "Then the proof is gone," Ben said, his voice laced with defeat. I looked from the photo of my husband to the bruised face of my son. The same fight, the same enemy, the same scars, just a different generation. "No, Mr. Carter," I said, a cold certainty settling in my chest. "The proof isn't gone. They just made the mistake of leaving behind a witness who has nothing left to lose. The ghost of my husband was in that room, and the future of my son was lying in that bed. The mountain had taken one of them. It wasn't getting the other." For 2 more days, I watched Ethan sleep, the grief inside me, slowly, inexorably, beginning to boil. It was a strange alchemy, the kind that happens when sorrow has no other place to go. It hardens, it sharpens, it turns from a crushing weight into a tempered blade. The moment of transformation came on the 5th day. Ethan's doctor said he was going to make a full recovery, though there would be permanent nerve damage in his hand and a web of scars on his face. He would live, but he would forever carry the physical reminder of his courage. As I watched the doctor walk away, the last of my sadness evaporated, replaced by a pure, crystalline rage. It was a cold anger, not a hot one. It was the kind of anger that doesn't scream, it plans. That evening, I went home for the first time in days. The house was silent, stale. The grandfather clock seemed to tick with a mournful slowness. I walked into Frank's old study, a room I hadn't touched since he died. His books on history and geology lined the shelves. His favorite armchair sat in the corner, the leather worn smooth. It smelled of him, of old paper and pipe tobacco. This was my sanctuary of grief, a place I came to feel close to him. But tonight, it wasn't comfort I was seeking. It was inspiration. Frank was a quiet man, but he was methodical. He believed in order, in planning. He would have been devastated by what happened to Ethan, but he wouldn't have just wept. He would have acted. I sat down at his heavy oak desk, pulled out a fresh legal pad and one of his old fountain pens. The smooth, heavy feel of it in my hand was grounding. For 40 years, I had been Mrs. Collins, the teacher. I'd created lesson plans to teach children how to read, how to understand history, how to think critically. My job was to take a complex subject and break it down into understandable, achievable steps. And as I sat there, under the warm glow of the desk lamp, I realized that's exactly what I needed to do now. Victor Hale was a complex subject, a subject of greed, corruption, and brutality. It was time to write my final lesson plan. The heading I wrote at the top of the page was simple: The Education of Victor Hale. My objective, not just to expose him, but to dismantle his empire of fear piece by piece, using his own arrogance and cruelty against him, to make him feel the same helplessness he'd inflicted on my son, on this town. My materials: 1, my daughter, Sarah, a paralegal in the city with a mind as sharp as a tack and a fire in her belly that matched my own. 2, Ben Carter, the young reporter, ambitious, hungry for a real story, and still naive enough to believe the pen is mightier than the sword, he would be my mouthpiece. 3. The town itself, a sleeping giant of resentment. The families who had lost fathers, sons, and brothers to Hale's negligence, their stories would be my ammunition. My lesson plan had several stages. Phase 1, information gathering. We couldn't use the proof Ethan had gathered, but that didn't mean other proof didn't exist. Hale was arrogant. Arrogant men get sloppy. There had to be a paper trail. Disgruntled employees, people on his payroll who were buckling under the weight of their conscience. My task was to find them. Phase 2, confirmation. We needed undeniable proof, something that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or the ramblings of a grieving mother, a recording, a document, something solid. Phase 3, public disclosure. A newspaper article wasn't enough. Hale owned half the advertisers for the county paper. He could kill the story. We needed a stage he couldn't control, a place where the whole town, the whole world could be our witness, the annual town hall budget meeting. It was 6 weeks away. It was always live-streamed on the town's community Facebook page, a perfect public classroom. I wrote for hours, my handwriting, usually a neat teacher's cursive, becoming a sharp, angry scrawl. I diagrammed his network of influence, from the sheriff to the mayor. I listed potential allies, people who had quiet grievances against Hale. I thought about his weaknesses, his massive ego, his need for public adoration, his contempt for the very people he lorded over. I would use it all. By the time the first rays of dawn painted the sky a bruised purple, the legal pad was filled with notes, diagrams, and a step-by-step plan that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I looked at the title again, The Education of Victor Hale. My grief had finally curdled into a cold, hard rage, and in the quiet of my study, I had just outlined a lesson he would never, ever forget. Class was about to be in session. The first step was to build my army, an army of 3. I called my daughter, Sarah. First, she was on the next bus from the city, arriving with a small suitcase and a face set like stone. Sarah had her father's practicality, but my fire. When she saw Ethan in that hospital bed, the fire in her eyes turned into a righteous inferno. She didn't cry. She held my hand and said, "What's the plan? Mom, tell me what we need to do." I walked her through the lesson plan I'd drafted in Frank's study. She listened, her paralegal mind absorbing every detail, identifying potential legal pitfalls, suggesting ways to ensure any evidence we gathered would be admissible, if it ever came to that. She pointed out that we needed to operate under the assumption that our phones were tapped and we were being watched. "We go old school," she said, her voice low. "Cash only, face-to-face meetings, burner phones if we have to." Seeing her fierce determination, a piece of the weight on my soul lifted. I wasn't alone in this. Our second recruit was Ben Carter. We arranged to meet him at a Greasy Spoon diner 2 towns over, a place where no one would know our faces. He was younger than I expected, with ink stains on his fingers and an eagerness that was both endearing and a little worrying. He slid into our booth, his eyes darting around nervously. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, pulling out a reporter's notebook. "I've been doing some digging since we spoke. Hale has a shell corporation registered in Delaware. He uses it to buy up property around here, usually from families who've had a workplace accident and are desperate for cash." Sarah leaned forward, her voice intense. "Mr. Carter, Ben, we need to be clear about what we're asking. This isn't just a story about corporate greed. Victor Hale put my brother in the hospital. He is a dangerous man. If you help us, you'll be putting yourself in his crosshairs." Ben's gaze didn't waver. He looked from Sarah to me, and I saw a flicker of something beyond ambition in his eyes, a genuine spark of journalistic integrity. "My grandfather was a miner," he said quietly. "He died of a lung disease the company refused to recognize. I grew up hearing stories about men like Hale. I got into this business to tell the stories that people are too afraid to tell. This is one of those stories." He closed his notebook. "I'm in. What do you need?" That dusty diner booth became our first war room. Over lukewarm coffee and stale donuts, we laid out the battle lines. Sarah would use her legal access to trace the ownership of Hale's shell corporations and look for financial irregularities. Ben would be our eyes and ears, using his press credentials to ask questions and dig into public records, building permits, safety citations, campaign donations. My job, we all agreed, was the most dangerous. I was the face of the operation, the one who would have to connect with the people in Blackwater Creek. I had been a teacher here for 40 years. I had taught half the town. I had christened their children and mourned their dead. If anyone could get them to talk, it was me. My first target was a woman named Maria Rossi. Her husband, Gino, had been Frank's best friend. He died in a methane explosion 6 years ago, an explosion the company had blamed on Gino's own negligence. I knew better. Frank had told me Gino had been complaining about the faulty gas sensors for weeks. I found Maria tending the small garden in her front yard, her back bent with a weariness that went bone deep. When I told her what had happened to Ethan, her eyes filled with a familiar, haunted pain. "They never pay, Martha," she whispered, wiping her hands on her apron. "They just write a check and the world moves on?" I looked her straight in the eye. "I'm not moving on, Maria. Not this time. I'm going to make him pay. For Gino. For Frank. For my Ethan. But I need help. I need Gino's story." She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the mountain that loomed over her house. Fear was a habit, hard to break. But then, she looked back at me, at the desperation and determination in my own eyes, and something shifted. She nodded slowly. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put on some coffee. I still have all his old work logs." In that moment, an alliance was forged, not just between me, my daughter, and a young reporter, but between me and the ghosts of my town. We were finally going to speak for the dead. Our first real break came from an unlikely source, Victor Hale's own bloated ego. The company was holding a community appreciation luncheon, a farcical event where Hale would hand out a few oversized checks to the library and the fire department, while the local news affiliate filmed him smiling like a benevolent king. It was a performance, and everyone knew it, but it was also an opportunity. Ben found out that a small, invitation-only meeting for community leaders, the mayor, the sheriff, a few business owners, was scheduled for an hour before the main event, a chance for Hale to ensure his puppets were all singing from the same hymn sheet. "I can't get in," Ben told us during a hushed phone call. "Press is barred until the public event, but..." He trailed off. "But you," he said to me, "are Martha Collins. You taught the mayor's children. You volunteer at the library. You are the very picture of a respected community elder." A plan began to form, audacious and terrifying. Sarah acquired a piece of technology I'd only ever seen in spy movies, a digital audio recorder disguised as an ornate silver brooch. It was tiny, powerful, and utterly innocuous against the collar of my Sunday best blouse. "Just press the center stone once to start, once to stop," she instructed, her hands surprisingly steady as she pinned it to my coat. "Mom, you don't have to do this. It's too risky." I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. A 68-year-old woman with kind eyes and silver hair, dressed for a church social. The perfect disguise. He won't see me coming, I said, more to convince myself than her. Walking into that private meeting room at the community hall was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the low murmur of men who were used to getting their way. Victor Hale stood in the center of the room, a bear of a man with a florid face and eyes as cold and hard as chips of anthracite coal. He saw me, and for a moment, his smile faltered. He knew who I was. He knew what he had done to my son. But my presence there, at his event, must have struck him as a sign of weakness, of a broken old woman seeking some sort of handout. He composed himself, his lips twisting into a smirk of pity. "Martha," he boomed, approaching me. I was so terribly sorry to hear about Ethan's accident. So clumsy. That boy. A real tragedy. My blood ran cold, but I kept my face placid, my hands clasped in front of me to hide their shaking. My thumb brushed against the cool stone of the brooch. I pressed it. "Thank you for your concern, Victor," I said, my voice quiet and steady. I was just hoping to ask the council for a small variance for a new community garden in my neighborhood. It was a plausible lie, a harmless civic project. It was the perfect cover. Disarmed. He waved a dismissive hand. Of course. We'll take care of it." He turned his back on me then, confident that the insignificant old woman was handled. He gathered his inner circle, and I faded back towards the wall, pretending to study a framed map of the county. And he started to talk, with the recorder silently capturing every word. Hale laid out his plans. He bragged about the state senator he had in his pocket. He laughed about the environmental impact study he'd paid a university professor to fake. And then he talked about Ethan. "The Collins kid is a lesson to the rest of them," Hale said, his voice dripping with venom. "You get ambitious, you get your wings clipped. We made sure the official report was airtight. He tripped. End of story." The mayor chuckled nervously. "What if he talks when he recovers?" Hale took a long drag from his cigar. "He won't. And even if he does, who are they going to believe? A disgruntled employee with a grudge? Or me?" He gestured around the room. "Or us. We own this valley. Every rock, every tree, every soul." He let out a low, rumbling laugh. It wasn't a sound of joy. It was the sound of possession. I stood there, a ghost against the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had it. We had captured Victor Hale's venom on that tiny device. His voice, stripped of its public charm, was a chilling confirmation of the evil we were determined to drag into the light. It was the devil's recorded lullaby. And I knew, in that moment, it would be the song that put his empire to sleep for good. The recording was a bombshell, but Sarah tempered our excitement with a dose of legal reality. "It's powerful, Mom. But a good lawyer could argue it's taken out of context. He could say you entrapped him. We need something more. Something cold, hard, and written in ink." She was right. We had the spoken confession. Now we needed the paper trail to back it up. We needed to find the proof Ethan had lost. That search led me to the last place I ever wanted to go, the Hale Mining Administrative Offices, not in person, of course, but through a contact. My next lesson involved finding a student on the inside who was ready to break the rules. I spent a week going through my old class rosters, yearbooks spanning 4 decades. I wasn't just looking for names, I was looking for personalities, for family histories, for any sign of a crack in Hale's wall of silence. My search stopped on a name from 15 years ago, Daniel Miller. I remember Danny as a quiet, meticulous boy who was brilliant at math but terrified of public speaking. His father had worked in the accounting department at Hale Mining for 30 years before being forced into early retirement with a meager pension. Danny, I learned through the town grapevine, had followed in his father's footsteps. He was now a mid-level clerk in the payroll and accounts department. He was quiet, unassuming, and invisible. Perfect. Getting a message to him was delicate. I couldn't call the office. I ended up leaving a note with his mother, an old acquaintance from the church bake sale committee, simply asking if he would meet me for coffee to discuss a community history project. To my surprise, he agreed. We met at the same diner where I'd first met Ben. The man who sat across from me was a shadow of the boy I remembered. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes were perpetually downcast, and his hands trembled as he stirred his coffee. He was a man drowning in quiet desperation. I didn't beat around the bush. I told him about Ethan. I told him about my plan. I watched his face pale, his eyes widen in fear. He started to shake his head, ready to bolt. "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He'd destroy me. I have a family." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Danny, I taught you in my class. You were the boy who always stood up to the bullies for the smaller kids, even when you were scared. That boy is still in there. Victor Hale is a bully on a grand scale." I told him about Maria Rossi, about the faulty gas sensors that killed her husband. I told him about the stories I was collecting from other families, a litany of suffering and injustice. Then I played him a small portion of the recording from my brooch, just 10 seconds. Just Hale's voice saying, "We own this valley, every rock, every tree, every soul." Daniel flinched as if he'd been struck. The color drained from his face. He stared into his coffee cup for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with tears of shame. "My own son," he said, his voice barely audible. "Had an asthma attack last spring so bad he was hospitalized. They said it was the dust from the new strip mine, the company's own air quality reports, the ones I have to file. They're all fake. I know they are. I see the real numbers before they're changed." That was the crack I was looking for. The weight of his own complicity was crushing him. He was a good man trapped in a bad system. "I can't get you the safety report," he said, shaking his head. "They're kept under lock and key, but there's something else." He explained that for years. Hale had been using a slush fund, disguised as a community outreach budget, to pay people off. Extra payments to the families of men killed in accidents to ensure their silence. Undocumented bonuses for foremen who cut corners. Regular payments to the sheriff and the mayor. It was all there, coded in a separate, physical ledger that was kept in the archives. "It's old-fashioned," Daniel whispered. "Hale doesn't trust computers for this stuff. He calls it his ledger of lost souls." 2 nights later, a large manila envelope appeared on my front porch in the dead of night. Inside, there were no notes, no letter, just a slim, black ledger book. I opened it. Page after page was filled with neat, precise columns, dates, names, amounts, and a column labeled Reason, T. Johnson, Accident Silence, Sheriff B. Miller, Monthly Retainer, Mayor K. Finch, Zoning Variance. It was a meticulous record of a town's soul being sold off piece by piece. A disgruntled clerk, drowning in guilt, had slipped us the key to the entire conspiracy. We now had Victor Hale's voice, and we had his book of sins. With the ledger and the recording, we had the sword and the shield. The next few weeks were a blur of clandestine activity. Sarah, Ben, and I worked out of my kitchen, the scent of coffee and conspiracy hanging heavy in the air. The ledger was our roadmap. Sarah painstakingly cross-referenced the names and dates with property deeds and public records, building a web of evidence so thick and tangled that not even the slickest lawyer could unravel it. Ben, meanwhile, began writing. He wasn't writing an article. He was writing a script, a narrative that would weave together the recording, the ledger, and the personal stories of the victims I had been gathering. Our plan was to present it all at the town hall meeting, a multimedia expose that would leave no room for doubt. We were so focused on our work, on building our case, that we almost forgot one crucial thing. The dragon we were trying to slay was not yet dead. He was wounded, perhaps, but still dangerous. The first sign that Hale knew something was wrong came subtly. A black SUV, the kind Hale's top managers drove, started parking at the end of my street. It would sit there for hours, its tinted windows like vacant eyes, watching my house. Then my phone line started crackling with static whenever I made a call. Sarah confirmed my fears. "We're being watched. Mom, he's getting nervous." The true warning shot, however, was far more personal. I woke one morning to a scene of quiet devastation in my garden. For 30 years, I had cultivated a bed of prize-winning hybrid tea roses, a passion I'd shared with Frank. They were my pride and joy, a splash of vibrant life against the gray backdrop of our coal town. That morning, every single rosebush had been decapitated. The brilliant red, pink, and yellow blooms lay scattered and crushed on the ground, and splashed across my white porch steps like a gruesome welcome mat was a long, dripping smear of red paint. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The message was as clear as if it had been spelled out in blood. "We know what you're doing. We can touch you. We can destroy what you love." I stood there on my porch, the cold morning air biting at my skin, and looked at the carnage. I should have been scared. A part of me was, but the overwhelming emotion was a fresh surge of white-hot fury. This was the act of a cornered animal, a thug lashing out because he was losing control. The roses were a connection to my past, to my life with Frank, to the peace I had cultivated after his death. By destroying them. Hale thought he was taking something from me. But he was wrong. He was just reminding me of exactly what I was fighting for. I didn't call the sheriff. I knew it would be useless. Instead, I called Ben. "I have a new opening for your story," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Get your camera." He came over immediately. He photographed the destroyed roses, the paint on the steps, the black SUV that was still parked at the end of the street. It was more evidence, more proof of Hale's character. This wasn't just about corporate corruption anymore. It was about a pattern of intimidation and terror. The morning I found my prize-winning roses decapitated and my porch splashed with red paint, I knew Hale could feel our net tightening around him. He had stopped being the confident king in his castle and had become the predator in the dark. And it meant our plan was working perfectly. We were just over a week away from the town hall meeting. The final act was about to begin. The final week before the town hall meeting felt like the calm before a hurricane. The air itself seemed thick with unspoken tension. The black SUV was a constant presence, a silent sentinel at the edge of my world. Sarah had returned to the city to finalize her research and prepare copies of our evidence, planning to come back the night before the meeting. It was just me in the house, surrounded by Frank's books, my lesson plan, and the ghosts of my past. I spent my days going over the presentation with Ben, rehearsing what I would say, timing the audio clips, deciding which entries from the ledger would be the most damning. The night before the meeting, exhaustion finally claimed me. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind of heavy slumber that only comes after weeks of relentless stress. I was awoken not by a sound, but by a smell. Acrid smoke, sharp and choking, and an unnatural, flickering orange light dancing outside my bedroom window. For a moment, my sleep-addled brain couldn't process it. Then, a primal wave of adrenaline hit me. I threw back the covers and ran to the window. The side of my porch was engulfed in flames. Panic seized me, cold and absolute. My first thought was the evidence. The original ledger, the recorder, the hard drive with all of Ben's work. It was all in Frank's study. I grabbed my robe, my heart hammering against my ribs, and ran out of my bedroom. The smoke was thicker in the hallway, stinging my eyes, catching in my throat. I could hear the roar and crackle of the fire now, a hungry, living thing that was devouring my home. I burst into the study and grabbed the heavy metal lockbox from Frank's desk drawer where we'd stored everything. It was hot to the touch. The smoke was getting thicker, blacker. I knew I only had seconds. As I turned to leave, my eyes fell on the framed photograph on the desk, the one of Frank and a young Ethan, the one I'd held in the hospital. Without thinking, I grabbed it, tucked it under my arm with the lockbox, and stumbled out of the room. The main hallway was a tunnel of smoke. The front door was blocked by a wall of fire. The back door. I had to get to the back door. I coughed, my lungs burning, my eyes streaming. I could feel the intense heat through the soles of my slippers. I finally fumbled the back door open and burst out into the cold night air, collapsing onto the grass in my backyard, gasping, choking. Clutching the lockbox and the photograph to my chest, I sat there on the damp grass and watched my house burn. The home where I'd raised my children, the home where I'd loved my husband, the home where I had grieved him. Every memory, every ghost was being consumed by the flames. Fire trucks wailed in the distance, but I knew they would be too late. This wasn't an accident. This was Hale's final desperate move. He wasn't trying to warn me anymore. He was trying to erase me, erase the evidence, erase the threat. A strange, terrifying calm washed over me. The fear was gone, burned away with my possessions. The grief for my home was a dull ache, but it was overshadowed by something else, a profound and absolute clarity. He had taken my son's health. He had taken my husband's life. And now he had taken my home. He had systematically stripped away every layer of the life I had built, every anchor of comfort and security. He thought it would break me. But as I watched the flames consume the last physical ties to my past, I felt not fear, but a terrifying liberation. He had just made the gravest mistake of his life. He had just given me nothing left to lose. My baptism by fire was complete. Tomorrow, I would walk into that town hall meeting not as a grieving mother or a frightened old woman, but as a ghost with a fire of her own, and I was going to burn his whole world to the ground. The next evening, I stood at the back of the Blackwater Creek Town Hall, a place I'd been for countless school plays and bake sales. Tonight, it felt different. It felt like a courtroom, an arena. The room was packed. Word had spread about the fire at my house, and the nervous energy in the air was palpable. People who normally never attended these meetings were here, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and a tiny, flickering spark of hope. Up on the dais sat the mayor and the town council, looking uncomfortable in their cheap suits, and in the front row, holding court, was Victor Hale. He turned and saw me, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was a smile of triumph. He thought he had won. He thought the fire had destroyed my evidence and my spirit. He had no idea I was clutching the original ledger and the silver brooch recorder in my handbag. Ben was at the side of the room with a laptop and a projector, ready. Sarah was next to him, her expression grim and focused. She had driven all night after I called her from a neighbor's house, her shock turning to cold fury when she saw the smoldering ruins of our family home. She simply squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Let's finish this." The meeting droned on with the usual boring agenda items, zoning permits, budget reports. I waited, My heart was a steady, slow drum in my chest. Finally. The mayor opened the floor for public comment. This was my moment. I walked slowly, deliberately, down the central aisle. A hush fell over the room. Every eye was on me. I could feel Hale's stare like a physical weight. I reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the faces of my town, my neighbors, my former students, the widows and children of the men this town had chewed up and spit out. "My name is Martha Collins," I began, my voice clear and strong, echoing slightly in the silent room. "And last night, I lost my home, but I am not here for your pity. I am here to talk about why it was burned." Hale started to rise, a protest on his lips. But the mayor, seeing the look in my eyes, waved him down. "For decades," I continued, "we have lived under the shadow of a single entity, Hale Mining. It has given us jobs, yes, but what has it taken in return? It took my husband, Frank Collins, with black lung. It took Gino Rossi in a methane explosion caused by faulty sensors. And 3 weeks ago, it tried to take my son, Ethan, because he was brave enough to speak out about the unsafe conditions that are putting every single one of our husbands, sons, and brothers at risk every day." A murmur went through the crowd. I had their attention. "Mr. Hale would have you believe my son's beating was an accident. He would have you believe the fire at my house was an accident." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then I looked directly at Victor Hale. "But Mr. Hale has a habit of creating convenient accidents. He's become careless. He talks." From the side of the room, Ben hit a key on his laptop, and suddenly, Victor Hale's voice filled the hall, amplified through the speakers, chilling and clear. "The Collins kid is a lesson to the rest of them. You get ambitious, you get your wings clipped." A collective gasp swept through the audience. Hale's face went from smug to sheet white in an instant. I let the recording play, his bragging about owning the state senator, his laughter about the faked environmental report, and the most damning line of all, "We own this valley. Every rock, every tree, every soul." When the recording ended, the silence was deafening. I held up the black ledger. "He doesn't just own souls with fear," I said, my voice ringing with righteous anger. "He buys them." Ben switched the projector on, and on the screen behind the stunned town council, images of the ledger's pages appeared, blown up for all to see. Sheriff B, Miller, monthly retainer. The sheriff sank lower in his chair. Mayor K, Finch, zoning variance. The mayor looked like he was going to be sick. Page after page, a monument to his corruption, was laid bare for the town to witness. The live stream was carrying this to hundreds of homes. There was no hiding. "This is your king," I cried, my voice breaking with the grief and rage of a lifetime. "This is the man who sends your children into the earth in unsafe conditions while he uses his profits to buy the silence of our leaders. The fire didn't destroy the evidence. Mr. Hale, it just burned away my fear." It was over. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in a groundswell of pure, unadulterated rage from the people. Victor Hale was frozen in his seat, his empire of fear crumbling around him in a matter of minutes. State troopers, alerted by Ben before the meeting, entered quietly from the back of the hall, with the cameras rolling and the whole town watching. I had stood before them all and played the devil's lullaby. And finally, everyone was listening. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The state troopers led a stunned Victor Hale out of the town hall in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief. The live stream, which Ben had cleverly patched into a regional news feed, went viral. Blackwater Creek was suddenly national news. The mayor and the sheriff resigned in disgrace before charges could even be filed. The state attorney general's office descended on the town, using our evidence. the ledger, the recording, the witness testimonies I had gathered, as a battering ram to break down the walls of Hale Mining. What they found was even worse than we had imagined. Decades of systemic corruption, environmental crimes, and a callous disregard for human life that was staggering. The company was forced into receivership. The Department of Labor levied the largest fine in its history for safety violations, and a class action lawsuit, filed on behalf of every family who had lost someone in that mine for the past 30 years, resulted in a settlement in the tens of millions of dollars. The money wouldn't bring back the dead, but it was an acknowledgement, a validation of their stolen lives. It was a promise of a future for their children, a future not dependent on the whims of a corrupt tycoon. My son, Ethan, watched it all from his hospital bed, a slow, painful smile spreading across his bruised face as he saw Hale being led away on the news. The scars on his face would remain, but the shadow behind his eyes began to recede. He was no longer just a victim. He was the catalyst. His courage had been the spark, and I had just been the one to fan it into a wildfire. As for me, I became an unlikely local hero. People would stop me in the grocery store, their eyes filled with a gratitude that was humbling. The silence of fear that had choked our town for so long was replaced by a new sound, the sound of people talking, organizing, planning their own future. They voted in a new town council, one made up of miners' wives and small business owners. They started a community fund with the settlement money to provide scholarships and retrain workers. The valley began to breathe again. My house was gone, a pile of charred timber and ash. The insurance money came, but I didn't rebuild. Not there. The memories were too thick. Instead, I bought a small cottage on the other side of town, one with a little garden where I could plant new roses. It was smaller, quieter, but it was mine. Sometimes, I would drive by the old lot and then up to the hill where Victor Hale's mansion, now seized by the state, stood empty and dark, a monument to a fallen king. The silence that returned to our valley was different now. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of fear. It was a quiet born of peace, of justice finally served. After the arrests and the headlines, after the lawyers had packed their briefcases and the news crews had moved on to the next story, what remained was us. A town that had found its voice, a people that had remembered their strength. The echo in the valley was no longer one of grief, but of a resilience we had forgotten could ever exist. A few months ago, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, I took a drive up to the cemetery where Frank is buried. The wind was blowing down from the mountain, but it didn't feel threatening anymore. It just felt like the wind. I placed a bouquet of the first new roses from my garden on his grave. They were a brilliant, defiant yellow. I told him all about what had happened. I told him about Ethan's recovery, about Sarah's courage, about the town waking up. I told him we had finally gotten justice for him, for Gino, for all of them. In the end, this story isn't really about revenge. Revenge is a fire that consumes you. This was about justice. Justice is a fire that cleanses, that clears the old, dead wood to make way for new growth. It's about the simple, profound truth that no one is above the consequences of their actions, and that the courage of one ordinary person multiplied by a community can be the most powerful force on earth. We can be pushed, we can be broken, and we can be burned to the ground. But from those ashes, something stronger, something truer, has a chance to rise. What about you? Have you ever had to find a strength you didn't know you possessed to stand up for something you believed in? What does the word justice mean to you in your own life? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of the fight for what's right. Your support means the world.